As an empirical background of today's exposition, I will use the current crisis around the coronavirus. I will differentiate between three types of sanitation politics or biopolitics, a term coined by Foucault. He differentiated three models along with three diseases. Let's first see the leprosy model, the plague model, and the smallpox model. From these three infectious diseases, Foucault derived three forms of government reactions, that is, three forms of dealing with large-scale medical calamities. Leprosy was a contagious disease mentioned since ancient time in India, China, Greece, and Italy. It became more common in the 15th century and the 16th century through poor hygiene and crowded cities. At this time, the leprosy asylums were established. The ill were isolated from the rest of society, confined in leprosariums. In Germany, we had more than 1,000 of them. In Macau, the former Cahos leper colony remembers these times of strict isolation and confinement of the sick. The restrictions to contain the plague went further. The borders of kingdoms were closed, even city gates came down. There were strong demands and practices of strict confinement of citizens in their homes. Foucault writes about this: it's a segmented, immobile, frozen space. Each individual is fixed in his place, and if he moves, he does so at the risk of his life, contagious or punishment. Earliest evidence of the smallpox was discovered in Egyptian mummies. In the 18th century in Europe, more of 400,000 people per year died from this infectious disease. And there was long smallpox too. We know about long COVID now. A lot of people went blind and extensive scarring of their skin happened. Yet in the times of French Revolution, government policies now had to take into account the overall advances in political and economic freedoms. Modern societies could not be handled like totally surveilled and controlled cities of the plague times in the medieval times. The emerging liberal way of government had to consider the different voices in society and in public space, though paying the price of higher infection rates. No zero smallpox policies anymore, no eradication of the virus, but living with it. The new power structures in government and society coexisted with the virus, knew about its development, gathered data, and organized medical mobilizations, which still tend to normatize and discipline the individuals. An overreach in direction of the plague model was never far away. Isolation of the supposed sick are still an option. The motivation to accept this invitation of Anna Alves here to talk is a consequence of a certain preoccupation which took hold of me during the start and the further development of today's pandemic. These worries were intensified only when I left the safe haven of Macau 2 months ago and ventured a trip to Europe, to my home continent, especially Germany and Portugal. I arrived in Frankfurt with an incident value of 74. I saw disciplined fellow citizens queuing for rolls and bread in front of bakeries. In the cold, it was 8 degrees in the morning when I arrived there. People dividing among themselves a certain amount of shopping carts in the supermarkets. No inside dining in restaurants possible. I moved on to Portugal with an incident value of 120 at my arrival, driving around in a rented car. The dinner with friends and family at the very first night was pleasant, only to learn the day after that the cook had been tested positive for the virus. I did not do a test. I left in direction to Algarve for a few days, only to learn there that Lisbon had been put down Under lockdown, the very weekend, I had to give back my car at the airport. I drove there anyhow. No one stopped me. No one tried to verify what I had to do in Lisbon. The incidence skyrocketed already to 220 cases per 100,000 citizens at this time. I flew back to my home city, Frankfurt. The incidence there had dropped to 22. I'm back now in my second home, Macau, since 4 days. I flew in via Singapore in companion of the suspected COVID-19 case, as the local authorities found out through a quite rigorous screening process still at the airport. I'm talking to you now from the hotel room of one of the quarantine hotels supervised by the government. The official to measure my temperature will arrive soon at 6 o'clock and will do some other tests with me if I'm still okay. Philosophy, my dear listeners, philosophy flourishes in a time of crisis. This was true when Athens had lost its battle against Sparta. Then a Socrates appeared and said his famous sentence, "I know that I don't know." Confucius tried to make his voice heard during the Warring Kingdoms and maintained also that I only transmit, he said, but I don't create nothing new. I believe in the ancient times. I love them. I study them with zeal. And it was at a time of mass murder and World War when Adorno and Horkheimer and later Habermas appeared and discovered the flip side of Kant's and Hegel's advancement of reason. Its only instrumental usage in capitalism and state administrations. I don't cite now Habermas or Adorno because I think you know them enough to believe me. All this made me read two classics from other times of crisis once again. I chose Confucius and Habermas for this. Confucius because of the actual fourth or fifth or sixth revival in Chinese philosophy, and Habermas because I saw him personally still going strong at 19 plus years in Frankfurt recently, having turned himself into the most global philosopher of our times. There's a nice book in German up to now called Global Habermas, also discussing him in Portugal and China and a lot of countries in the world. Comparing these two philosophers of quite different times and places, I came to the following preliminary conclusion around three topics: their conservatism, their communication features, and the important role of a public intellectual and a public political advisor. I think the two are conservative thinkers. Both philosophers are conservative thinkers. Confucius goes back to the Zhou dynasties 100 years before his time. In this epoch, he sees a society and leaders in harmony with each other, practicing the proper rules and rights, the Li, within a system of established moral and social norms. Habermas maintains that the tradition of being progressive has to be maintained against the deconstruction of socially useful authorities. Yet, some sort of progressivism has to be secured against the blind maintenance of historically overcome authorities. And conservative Habermas is in his resistance against the colonization of the life world by the systemic imperatives of administration and economy. I go now to the second point, which I tried to compare inside the two philosophers. The question of how understanding of human beings is brought upon and secured, Habermas solved with his concept of communicative action, kommunikatives Handeln in German. This action rests on the thesis that if people involved in speech acts, like we are doing now here, they open their minds and mouths in a meaningful way, The premise is that something meaningful has to be communicated to the other. As a speaker to someone, I recognize the other as a person potentially worth to speak to. I recognize his or her personhood, and that's already a lot. Sure, there are all sorts of distortions of these communicative acts, but a minimum of recognition of the other remains. A social order emerges locally, nationwide, and tendentially globally. A deliberative world society will gather shape with the time, and Habermas uses the United Nations system as one of its disclosures. Confucius, on the other hand, for him, there pre-exists, before we are born, certain rights, a system of moral and societal norms, the lei in Cantonese, which are already mentioned. Lei, which we are already born into. Family and our communities shape us along these overcome norms. We learn these norms, and with self-reflection upon them, we form our moral consciousness and participate willy-nilly in the moral will formation of our community, our kingdom at the time, tendentially today the world. Learning, very important for Confucius, practicing and complementingly becomes crucial for every human being. A lifelong learning process starts, assimilating and accommodating the teaching and rights of the past, first for oneself as self-improvement, for one's family, for the community, and then for humankind as a whole. Today's discussion, and this was very interesting for me, reading recent discussions, for example, at the conference 2017 in Albany, United States, where I had been some time and know some people still. The discussion around a post-new Confucianism explicitly draws on what Habermas calls civil society, in which citizens, and I cite now, old or gray, male or female, powerful or powerless, are free to participate in public discourse. That's from this book. When I'm finished, I can give the references. Now, the third point I want to make about the two which impressed me as things which can be similar and can be used as a bridge between two very distant philosophers from different times and different cultural and political backgrounds. Intellectuals and political advisors, Habermas and Confucius as political or advisors and intellectuals in their societies. Habermas and Confucius experienced the role of public intellectuals and functioned in their times as political advisors. They found their balance between a sense for the reality they worked in and the possibilities their actual world contained. Confucius explicitly talks about the task to analyze the situation someone is in, to look at problems from the perspective of the individual and the very community, the cycle you are in, family, peer group, kingdom, and his virtue ethics is one of the person in a certain situation. Yet it is to be overseen and even commanded by the golden rule. See, that's not only from the individual I go on, but the golden rule. Don't do to others what you don't want that others do to you. He explicitly says this. I don't have to cite him now because of this. Then I come to the last point, intellectuals and political advisors, the last point of my comparison. Now going to Habermas in this scene. Habermas often thought the public sphere to argue for rights when they had been violated and truths which have been suppressed. Because of these interventions in the public sphere, he was called upon and also Confucius was called upon by the ruling personnel of their time to offer their advice. In the case of Confucius, I don't know if this is true. Some maintained even that he proved himself in political skills in higher administrative positions. In a recent film I saw, 2 hours and a half, he's Minister of Defense of, I think, his home state, Lu, and even winning a battle with good tactics against the enemy. I come to the end. My rereading of Confucius and Habermas in times of crisis made me discover striking similarities between the two philosophers from two different cultural background and crisis times. First, there is a conservative grounding in both philosophies. Overcome rights and ways of being human have to be learned, to some extent appreciated and further developed. Once built institutions should not be abolished without thorough analysis of their worth for functioning of the very society they serve. The stress on an ethics of the situation, an ethics of the space where we live in, could be a soft way to prevent the overreach of Kant's and Habermas types of universalism. Anyhow, in both philosophies, the golden rule has the final say when problems emerge. Second, important for both regions under discussion is the fact that the political framework for this type of restrained conservatism is already there. In Europe, we have the nation states which, after 2 hot wars and a long cold one, are able to cooperate willy-nilly within the European Union. In China, after a century of imperialist humiliation, we encounter a strong nation state doing its utmost to develop a common national identity and its form of consensus decision-making. Communication with the other individual. Individual involvement in decision-making processes is only possible if I myself had been taught and enabled to communicate effectively. If I learned the language of my family, my region, if I had learned to use the correct words, concepts, and rights according to the situation. This is very important for Confucius. There is a stress on communication and participation both philosophies have. Distortions happen. They can be overcome by constant self-improvement and by using the full potential of the power of one or more languages. Language understood in the broader sense, that means also englobing geography, social, gender, and context. In the beginning of my talk, I said that crises are the time of philosophy. The time to examine our knowledge and our procedures now in a globalized world. Our problems are global. They need global cooperation for finding new ways of making this world more human, more habitable in relation to our health, our climate, our border worries. Maybe we are even in a new exological time, as Jaspers called the epoch of Confucius, Buddha, Socrates, and Jesus. That's 500 before and 500 after Christ was born. This pandemic showed every one of us the vulnerability of him or herself and the many others. Our political elites try to do their best to contain the disease and spell out politics and policies for it. It is unique in the history of a pandemic that we have had at our disposal various effective vaccines only months after the outbreak. I touched upon different pandemic policies we witness around the world. Instead of having a kind of Olympic medal count with indices, death rates, and hospital occupation rates, we see with Habermas and Confucius the worth of self-conscious citizens of the self and societally educated Zhu, this nobleman, the superior person in Cantonese, it would be Guan Zi. Citizen Habermas, Guan Zi in Confucius. My hope is that these citizens and these Guan Zis will encourage and help their ruling elites to open up to more scientific collaboration, more sharing of developed products and procedures. The pandemic and climate change are worldwide challenges. I hope humankind can and will solve this together. Thank you for your attention.